Late for his divorce hearing, the millionaire lost his entire fortune. His ex-wife and her lover celebrated, but they were far from imagining what fate had in store for them. The sun was just peeking over the horizon when John Miller, the most renowned real estate magnate in the city, awoke with a start. His clock read 6:30 in the morning, and a cold sweat ran down his forehead. Today was the day he had dreaded for so long, the divorce hearing that would end 12 years of marriage to Sarah Thompson. John got out of the king-size bed that now seemed too big for him alone. As he showered, memories of happy moments with Sarah flooded his mind. How had they gotten to this point? The long hours at the office, the endless arguments, the emotional distance, it had all contributed to this outcome. As he adjusted his tie in front of the mirror, John couldn't help but think of his children, Sophie and Matthew. How would this all affect them? Custody was the most painful point of this legal battle, and John was willing to fight tooth and nail for them. The ringing of the phone snapped him out of his thoughts. It was Raymond, his lawyer and lifelong friend John. "Where the hell are you?" "The hearing starts in half an hour and Sarah is already here with her lawyer." Raymond's voice sounded tense on the other end of the line. "I'm on my way, Raymond." There was a problem with the alarm clock, John lied, knowing that in reality fear had paralyzed him. "Hurry up, buddy, and get ready, because Sarah's not alone. David Sanchez is with her." John felt like he had been punched in the stomach. David Sanchez, the man Sarah had left him for, the lover who had destroyed his marriage. What was he doing there? "I'll be there in 10 minutes, John replied dryly before hanging up. As he drove his luxurious sports car through the city streets, John couldn't stop thinking about what awaited him. Not only would he have to face Sarah and the possibility of losing his children, but he would also have to see the face of the man who had stolen his wife. Arriving at the courthouse, John took a deep breath before getting out of the car. Camera flashes momentarily blinded him. Despite his tardiness, the paparazzi were waiting for him, hungry to capture every moment of this scandalous divorce that had dominated the headlines for weeks. "Mr. Miller, is it true that your wife is asking for half your fortune?" One reporter shouted. "How does it feel to see your wife with her lover in court?" Another asked John. Ignored the questions and strode purposefully toward the building entrance. In the lobby, Raymond was waiting for him with a worried expression. "John, thank goodness you made it. Sarah is playing dirty. She brought David to provoke you," Raymond warned him in a low voice. "I won't fall for her game, Raymond. I'm here for my kids, and for what's fair," John replied, trying to maintain his composure. When the courtroom doors opened, John felt his heart leap out of his chest. There was Sarah, as beautiful as ever, in a black dress that accentuated her figure. Next to her, David Sanchez, with an arrogant smile that made John's blood boil. Their eyes met for an instant, and John could see in Sarah's eyes a mixture of emotions: resentment, sadness, and something else he couldn't decipher. For a moment, he felt time rewind, and they were back to being the young lovers who had sworn eternal love to each other. But reality hit him when David placed his hand possessively on Sarah's shoulder. The judge entered the room and everyone stood up. John took a deep breath, preparing himself for the battle that was about to begin. Not only was his fortune at stake, but the future of his children and the life he had built with so much effort. As the judge began to speak, John couldn't help but think about how he had gotten to this point. How had love and trust turned into this all-out war? And most importantly, how would it all end? What John didn't know was that this was just the beginning of an emotional roller coaster that would test his strength, his love for his children, and his own identity. Fate had surprises in store that none of those present in that room could imagine. The judge's voice echoed through the courtroom as John tried to maintain his composure. To his right, Raymond furiously took notes, preparing to counter every argument Sarah's lawyer presented. Across the room, Sarah kept her gaze fixed on the judge, avoiding any eye contact with John. David, for his part, couldn't hide a satisfied smile that irritated John to his core. "Your Honor," began Sarah's lawyer, a middle-aged man in an impeccable suit, "my client, Mrs. Thompson, has been a devoted wife and an exemplary mother during the 12 years of her marriage to Mr. Miller. During this time, she has sacrificed her own career to raise their children and support her husband's business empire." We consider it fair that she receive adequate compensation for her years of dedication." John clenched his fists under the table. Dedication? Were the endless parties and luxury trips Sarah so enjoyed a form of sacrifice? Raymond stood up, ready to counter. "Your Honor, while we recognize Mrs. Thompson's role in raising the children, we cannot ignore the fact that she has enjoyed an exceptionally luxurious lifestyle during her marriage. Furthermore, Mrs. Thompson's infidelity—" "Objection," Sarah's lawyer interrupted. "Fidelity is not relevant to the division of assets." "Objection sustained," the judge replied. "Mr. Raymond, stick to the financial aspects of the case." John watched as Sarah tensed at the mention of her infidelity. For a moment he thought he saw a glimmer of guilt in her eyes, but it disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. The hearing continued, with a series of technical arguments about the division of properties, stocks, and other assets. John felt like a spectator in his own life, watching 12 years of marriage reduced to numbers and percentages. It was then that Sarah's lawyer dropped the bombshell no one expected. "Your Honor, my client is willing to make a proposal that could resolve this case expeditiously," he announced with a triumphant smile. "Mrs. Thompson is willing to cede full custody of the children to Mr. Miller in exchange for keeping 75% of the marital assets." A deathly silence fell over the courtroom. John felt the world stop. Was Sarah really willing to give up her children for money? The proposal was so outrageous that even the judge seemed baffled. Raymond leaned over to John, whispering frantically, "It's a trap, John. They can't be serious. They must have something else planned." John could barely process what was happening. He looked at Sarah, searching her eyes for some explanation, some indication that this was a cruel joke. But what he saw left him cold. Determination and a glimmer of greed he had never noticed before. David, for his part, looked like the cat that had eaten the canary. His smile had widened even more, and John could see him gently squeezing Sarah's hand under the table. The judge, recovering from the initial surprise, addressed John. "Mr. Miller, what is your opinion on this proposal?" John felt all eyes on him. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions and thoughts. On one hand, the idea of having full custody of his children was tempting. He could protect them, be with them without restrictions. But the price, was it worth losing almost everything he had worked for? And then, amid that mental chaos, John had an epiphany. This wasn't just about money or custody. It was a test, a defining moment that would reveal who he really was as a person and as a father. With a calm that surprised even Raymond, John stood up. "Your Honor, I appreciate my wife's generous offer. However, I must categorically reject it." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Sarah seemed genuinely surprised, while David frowned, clearly displeased. "My children are not a commodity to be negotiated." John continued firmly, "I cannot and will not put a price on them. What I propose is that we move forward with a fair agreement, both in terms of assets and shared custody. My children deserve to have both parents in their lives, and I am willing to work with Sarah to ensure that is the case, regardless of our personal differences." The judge nodded approvingly. "That seems a reasonable stance, Mr. Miller. Given these new developments, I think it would be prudent for both parties to take some time to reconsider their positions. I propose a 1-week recess for you to negotiate in good faith and present a joint proposal." As the session adjourned, John could feel Sarah's piercing gaze. For the first time since he had entered the courtroom, he saw something more than coldness in her eyes, confusion, and perhaps a hint of respect. As they left the courtroom, reporters pounced on them, hungry for statements. John limited himself to saying he trusted a fair agreement would be reached, while Sarah and David quickly slipped into a waiting car. That night, alone in his apartment, John reflected on the day's events. He had rejected an offer many would consider irresistible, but in his heart, he knew he had done the right thing. However, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something bigger, more complicated. What John didn't know was that his decision had set in motion a series of events that would change not only his life, but the lives of everyone involved in this drama. As he stared out the window at the city lights, He couldn't imagine the revelations and twists that fate had in store. For him, the week following the hearing was a whirlwind of emotions and discoveries for John as he prepared for negotiations with Sarah and her legal team. A series of unexpected events began to unravel the complex web of lies and secrets surrounding his marriage. It all started with a mysterious phone call. John was in his office, reviewing financial documents with Raymond, when his secretary informed him he had an urgent call from an unknown number. John Miller speaking. He answered cautiously. "Mr. Miller," said a female voice on the other end of the line, "my name is Elena Vega. You don't know me, but I have information that could be crucial to your divorce case." John glanced at Raymond with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "What kind of information?" he asked. "I can't discuss it over the phone," Elena replied, "but I assure you it will completely change your perspective on your wife and Mr. Sanchez. Can we meet in person?" After agreeing to meet at a discreet downtown cafe, John hung up the phone, his mind full of questions. Who was this woman, and what exactly did she know? The next day, John found himself sitting across from Elena Vega, a woman in her 40s with an intense and determined gaze. Wasting no time on formalities, Elena got straight to the point. "Mr. Miller, I am David Sanchez's ex-wife," she began, surprising John, "and I believe that both you and I have been victims of an elaborate scam." Over the next hour, Elena unraveled a story that left John stunned. According to her, David had a history of seducing wealthy women, orchestrating tumultuous divorces, and then disappearing with a substantial portion of the assets. Sarah was not the first, and if he wasn't stopped, she likely wouldn't be the last. "But why are you telling me this now?" John asked, still processing the information. Eleanor's eyes filled with unshed tears. "Because I lost everything, Mr. Miller. My dignity, my trust, my fortune. I can't allow another family to be destroyed by David's greed." John left the meeting with his head spinning. If what Elena said was true, Sarah wasn't just a victim of David's manipulation, but she was also in danger of losing everything. The following days were a frenzy of investigation. John, with the help of Raymond and a team of private investigators, began to unravel the truth behind Elena's words. They discovered a disturbing pattern. David Sanchez had been involved in at least 3 high-profile divorces over the past 10 years, always mysteriously disappearing shortly after a financial settlement was reached. Meanwhile, Sarah seemed increasingly distant and nervous. John observed her from afar, noticing how her demeanor changed when she was with David. He no longer saw the sparkle of love in her eyes, but a mixture of fear and doubt. The night before the team negotiation meeting, John received another unexpected call. This time it was from Sophie, his 15-year-old daughter. "Dad," she said in a trembling voice, "I need to talk to you. It's about Mom and that man." John felt his heart race. "Of course, sweetheart. Tell me what's going on." Sophie, between sobs, told him how she had overheard a conversation between Sarah and David. He was yelling at her dad. He said that if he didn't get the money, it all would have been for nothing. Mum was crying, saying she couldn't do that to you, that she couldn't leave us. Sophie's revelation was the final push John needed. He was now sure. He had to save Sarah, not just for the love they once shared, but for the sake of their children and for the woman he knew still existed beneath layers of manipulation and fear. The morning of the negotiation dawned grey and rainy, as if the weather reflected the emotional storm that was brewing. John arrived early at the law office where the meeting would take place, his mind repeatedly going over the plan he had outlined with Raymond. When Sarah entered the conference room, accompanied by David and her lawyer, John immediately noticed the dark circles under her eyes and the tension in her posture. For a moment, their eyes met, and John could see a flash of the woman he had fallen in love with so many years ago. Negotiations began with lawyers exchanging proposals and counteroffers. The atmosphere was tense, charged with contained emotions and hidden agendas. David, sitting next to Sarah, maintained a confident smile, as if he already had victory assured. That's when John decided to make his move. "Before we continue," he said, standing up, "there's something everyone needs to know." Ignoring the lawyer's protests, John began to reveal everything he had discovered about David Sanchez. He spoke of his previous scams, of destroyed marriages and vanished fortunes. With each word, he watched the color drain from David's face and Sarah's eyes widen with a mixture of horror and understanding. "Sarah," John said, addressing his wife directly for the first time in months, "I know we've had our problems. I know I've failed you in many ways, but I also know that deep down, you're still the strong, compassionate woman I fell in love with. This man," he pointed at David, who now seemed smaller in his chair, "has been manipulating you, using you to get to our money. But it's not too late to make things right." Sarah, tears in her eyes, looked at David, seeking a denial, an explanation, anything that could refute John's words. But David remained silent, his facade of confidence completely shattered. I didn't know," Sarah stammered finally. "I thought he loved me, that he wanted to help me start over." John approached her, ignoring Raymond's warnings. "I know, Sarah, and I'm sorry I wasn't there for you when you needed me, but I'm here now, and I want us to fix this together. Not for me, not for you, but for our children." The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. Everyone in the room held their breath, waiting to see how this unexpected turn of events would unfold. Finally, Sarah stood up, moving away from both David and John. "I need time," she said in a shaky voice. "I need to think about all of this." Before anyone could say anything more, Sarah hurried out of the room, leaving behind a chaos of emotions and unanswered questions. David, seeing his plan crumbling, tried to follow her, but John stopped him with a firm hand on his shoulder. "I think you've done enough damage," he said in a cold voice that left no room for discussion. As the lawyers argued about how to proceed, John stood by the window, watching the rain fall over the city. He knew this was just the beginning of a long and painful process of healing and reconciliation, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of hope. What John didn't know was that this revelation would trigger a series of events that would test not only his love for Sarah, but also his faith in justice and in himself. The path to truth and redemption was just beginning, and there would be more surprises and challenges to come. The days following the dramatic meeting were a whirlwind of emotions and changes. Sarah, overwhelmed by the truth about David and John's unexpected compassion, secluded herself at her sister's house, refusing to speak to anyone except her children. John, for his part, found himself on an emotional roller coaster. On one hand, he felt immense relief at having exposed the truth and potentially saved his family from a greater disaster. On the other, uncertainty about the future of his relationship with Sarah consumed him. It was Matthew, his 10-year-old son, who finally broke the impasse. One afternoon, while John was working in his home study, Matthew entered with a serious expression that seemed out of place on his young face. "Dad," he said, sitting down in front of John's desk, "are you going to get back together with Mom?" The question took John by surprise. "Matthew, it's complicated. Your mother and I have a lot to talk about." Matthew frowned. "But you saved her from the bad man, didn't you? In the movies, when the hero saves the girl, they always end up together." John couldn't help but smile at his son's childlike logic. "Real life isn't like the movies, champ, but I promise you that no matter what happens, your mom and I will always love you and your sister." That night, inspired by Matthew's words, John made a decision. He wrote a long letter to Sarah, pouring into it all his feelings, the regret for past mistakes, the pain of separation, the hope for a future together. He didn't ask for forgiveness or make grandiose promises. He simply offered honesty and the possibility of a new beginning. Meanwhile, Sarah struggled with her own demons. David's betrayal had shaken the foundations of her world, making her question every decision she had made in recent years. How could she have been so blind? How could she have risked her children's happiness for an illusion? It was in the midst of this emotional storm that she received John's letter. At first, she hesitated to open it, fearing more pain and recrimination. But when she finally mustered the courage to read it, John's words hit her like a wave of fresh water. She read the letter over and over, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. Each word seemed to undo a knot in her heart, allowing her to breathe more freely than she had in months. 3 days after receiving the letter, Sarah appeared at John's door. She was pale and visibly nervous, but there was a determination in her eyes that John recognized from the early days of their relationship. "We need to talk," she said simply. For hours, seated in the kitchen where they had once shared family breakfasts and romantic dinners, John and Sarah talked. They talked about past mistakes, misunderstandings, and unmet expectations. They talked about David and how his manipulation had exploited the cracks already existing in their marriage. And finally, they talked about the future. "I don't know if we can go back to what we were," Sarah said in a moment of vulnerability. "But I know I want to try. For us, for the kids, for the family we built together." John took her hand, feeling the familiar tingle that had always been there, even in the worst of times. "I don't want to go back to what we were," he replied. "I want us to build something new, something better. Together." That night, when Sophie and Matthew returned home, they found their parents in the living room, not magically reconciled but united on a common front for the first time in a long time. The road to reconciliation would not be easy. There would be couples therapy, long conversations, and moments of doubt. But for now, in that moment of new connection, there was hope. What John and Sarah didn't know was that their story of redemption was far from over. David Sanchez, humiliated and exposed, would not give up so easily. In the shadows, he was already planning his revenge, a revenge that would test the renewed bonds of the Miller family in ways none of them could imagine. The following months were a period of slow but steady healing for the Miller family. John and Sarah, committed to rebuilding their relationship, regularly attended couples therapy, and spent time together rediscovering the reasons they had fallen in love in the first place. Sophie and Matthew, initially cautious about their parents' reconciliation, began to relax as they saw the genuine effort both were making. Family dinners, once tense and silent, were again filled with laughter and lively conversation. On the legal front, things also seemed to be improving. With Sarah and John working together, their lawyers were able to reach a fair agreement on the division of assets and shared custody of the children. The divorce, which had once threatened to be a bitter battle, was now heading towards an amicable resolution. However, beneath this apparent calm, a storm was brewing. David Sanchez, whose reputation and plans had been destroyed by John's revelations, had disappeared from public view. But far from having abandoned his ambitions, David had spent the past months meticulously planning his revenge. On a sunny Sunday afternoon, while the Miller family enjoyed a picnic in the park, a shadowy figure watched them from a distance. David, unrecognizable under a carefully crafted disguise, studied John and Sarah's every move, every laugh of the children. His eyes glinted with a mixture of hatred and determination. "Enjoy while you can," he muttered to himself. "Soon you'll know what it really means to lose everything." That same night, in a small, discreet apartment on the outskirts of the city, David met with Elena Vega, the ex-wife who had warned John about his plans. "Is everything ready?" David asked, his voice cold and calculating. Elena, visibly uncomfortable, nodded. "Yes. But David, are you sure you want to do this? You've already caused enough damage." David looked at her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Dear Elena, this isn't about damage, it's about justice. John Miller destroyed my life, and now I will destroy his." What David didn't know was that Elena, consumed by guilt over her role in David's previous plans, had been secretly recording their conversations. As David gloated over his plans for revenge, Elena squeezed the small recording device in her pocket that could be the key to stopping him. Meanwhile, unaware of the threat looming over them, John and Sarah continued to work on their relationship. One night, while the children slept, they sat in the backyard sharing a bottle of wine and reminiscing about old times. "Do you remember our first date?" Sarah asked, laughing softly. "You were so nervous that you spilled your drink on my new dress." John joined in her laughter. "How could I forget? I thought I had ruined every chance with you, but you just laughed and said you liked men who could make things interesting." Sarah took John's hand, her expression becoming serious. "John, I know we've been through a lot and that we still have a long way to go, but I want you to know that I'm grateful. Grateful for your forgiveness, for your patience, for not giving up on our family." John squeezed her hand, feeling a surge of emotion. "Sarah, you and the kids are my life. No matter what happens, I will always fight for us." As John and Sarah shared that moment of connection, they couldn't imagine the storm that was coming, a storm that would test their renewed love and the strength of their family in ways they had never anticipated. The morning began like any other for the Miller family. John was preparing for an important business meeting. Sarah was helping the kids get ready for school, and the house buzzed with the familiar energy of a new day. No one could foresee that within hours their lives would take a dramatic turn. John was in the middle of his presentation when he received an urgent call from Sophie and Matthew's, school heart racing. He excused himself from the meeting and ran to his car. "What do you mean? They're not there?" John asked, his voice trembling as he spoke to the principal on the phone. "How can 2 children disappear from school?" The principal's answer only increased his panic. Apparently, a man who identified himself as the children's uncle had come to pick them up, presenting an authorization that seemed to be signed by Sarah. The children, recognizing the man from family photos, had gone with him without protest. John felt his world crumbling around him. He knew exactly who this uncle was, David Sanchez. Meanwhile, Sarah, who had been at a doctor's appointment, received the news with equal horror. She met John at the police station, both of them pale and shaking. "It's my fault," Sarah sobbed. "I should have been more careful. I should have warned the school about him." John hugged her tightly, struggling against his own fear and guilt. "It's not your fault, Sarah. It's David. It was always David." The next hours were a flurry of activity. Police launched a large-scale search, Amber Alerts were issued, and the media soon echoed the news of the kidnapping of famous businessman John Miller's children. As the city mobilized in search of Sophie and Matthew, John and Sarah faced their worst nightmare. Sitting in their living room, surrounded by police and detectives, they desperately tried to think of any clue that might lead them to their children. That's when John received a text message from an unknown number. "If you want to see your children again, you will come alone to the abandoned warehouse on Pier 17 at midnight. Bring the documents for all your properties and companies. One cop and the kids disappear forever." John felt a mixture of relief and terror. His children were alive, but in the hands of a desperate and dangerous man. Without a second thought, John began gathering the requested documents. Sarah, realizing his intentions, confronted him. "You can't go alone," she said, her eyes filled with tears. "It's too dangerous." John took her face in his hands. "Sarah, I'll do whatever it takes to bring our children back. Trust me." As John prepared for the encounter, ignoring warnings from the police and Sarah's pleas, he didn't know he was about to face not only David, but a truth that would change everything he believed he knew about his past and his family's. At the abandoned warehouse, David waited with a malevolent smile. Sophie and Matthew, scared but unharmed, were tied up in a corner, and next to them, to everyone's surprise, was Elena Vega with a look of guilt and determination on her face. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal secrets buried for years and test the limits of love, loyalty, and forgiveness. The abandoned warehouse was a maze of shadows and echoes as John entered, his heart pounding in his chest. The smell of rust and salt water permeated the air, mixing with the palpable fear emanating from every corner. "David!" John shouted, his voice echoing in the empty space. "I'm here. Let my children go." A cold, calculating laugh was the response. From the shadows emerged David, his face a mask of triumph and contempt. Behind him, Elena Vega gently pushed Sophie and Matthew, who looked at their father with a mixture of relief and terror. "Ah, John," David said, clapping slowly. "Always the hero, aren't you? Willing to sacrifice everything for your precious family. It's touching, really." John stepped forward, his eyes fixed on his children. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice broken with emotion. Sophie nodded, silent tears running down her cheeks. Matthew, trying to be brave, murmured a weak, "Yes, Dad." "The documents," David demanded, extending his hand. "Now." John pulled a thick envelope from his jacket and threw it at David's feet. "There you go, everything you asked for. Now let my children go." David bent down to pick up the envelope, his eyes shining with greed, but before he could open it, Eleanor stepped forward. "Wait, David," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Before you do anything, there's something everyone needs to know." David turned to her, his expression a mixture of confusion and rage. "What are you talking about, Elena? This isn't the time for your crises of conscience." Elena took a deep breath, looking first at David, then at John, and finally at the children. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I'm sorry for everything, but I can't go on with this lie anymore." And then, to the astonishment of everyone present, Elena began to unravel a story no one, not even David, expected to hear. "John," she said, looking him straight in the eye, "David isn't just a scammer, he's your brother." The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. John felt the world stop, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. "What?" He finally managed to articulate. "That's impossible. I don't have any brothers." Elena shook her head. "Yes, you do, one you never knew about. You see, your father, he had an affair many years ago. David is the result of that affair." David, who seemed as surprised as John, turned to Elena in fury. "What the hell are you talking about? This wasn't part of the plan." "The plan changed," Elena replied, pulling a small recorder out of her pocket. "I've recorded every conversation, every plan we've made. I can't be part of this anymore." As David struggled to comprehend this betrayal, John found himself in an emotional whirlwind. Memories of his childhood, fragments of overheard conversations, everything began to fit into a pattern he had never seen before. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why do all this?" David, recovering from the initial surprise, let out a bitter laugh. "Why? Because you had everything. Our father's love, the empire he built, the perfect family. While I grew up in poverty, not even knowing who my father was, until it was too late." John took a step towards David, his initial anger giving way to a deep sadness. "I had no idea, if I had known." "What?" David interrupted. "You would have welcomed me with open arms. You would have shared your fortune with me. Don't make me laugh." That's when Sophie, who had been listening to everything in silence, spoke. "Uncle David," she said softly, surprising everyone with the use of that title. "Family isn't about money or who has what. It's about love and forgiveness." Her words, innocent yet filled with wisdom, seemed to penetrate the armor of bitterness David had built over the years. For a moment, everyone could see the hurt and abandoned child hiding behind the hardened man. John, moved by an impulse he couldn't explain, approached David and placed a hand on his shoulder. "She's right," he said softly. "I can't change the past, but we can build a future together." David looked at John, then at the children, and finally at Elena. Years of resentment and plans for revenge now faced the possibility of having the family he had always longed for. As police sirens began to be heard in the distance, Sarah, unable to sit idly by, had alerted the authorities. David made a decision that would change the course of all their lives. What happened next would be remembered by all present as the moment when hatred gave way to love and vengeance gave way to forgiveness. But the path to true reconciliation and healing was just beginning. The days and weeks that followed the dramatic encounter in the warehouse were a whirlwind of emotions and changes for everyone involved. The news that famous businessman John Miller had a secret brother, and that this brother had orchestrated the kidnapping of his niece and nephew, became the scandal of the year. David, facing charges of kidnapping and extortion, surprised everyone by pleading guilty and expressing deep remorse for his actions. John, in an act that many considered incomprehensible, decided not to press additional charges and instead advocated for leniency from the court. "My brother acted from a place of pain and abandonment," John declared to the media. "I don't justify his actions, but I understand their origin. I believe in redemption and the healing power of family." Sarah, although initially reluctant, began to see the potential for healing in the situation. "Our children taught us a valuable lesson about forgiveness," she said in an interview. "If they can see beyond the pain caused by their uncle, Who are we to not try? As David served a reduced sentence, John worked tirelessly to unravel the truth about his father and his family's hidden past. He discovered old letters, forgotten photographs, and finally, a diary that revealed his father's torment over the son he could never openly acknowledge, Elena Vega, whose testimony and recordings were crucial in bringing the whole truth to light, found her own redemption. Working with organizations supporting victims of emotional scams, she began to use her experience to help others heal and recover. Sophie and Matthew, although initially traumatized by the kidnapping experience, showed amazing resilience. With the help of therapy and the unconditional love of their parents, they began to process what had happened and, surprisingly, to develop a genuine curiosity to know their uncle once he was out of prison. A year after the incident, the Miller family was preparing for an event that no one would have thought possible: David's first visit since his release. The tension in the house was palpable as they awaited his arrival. John paced the living room, Sarah nervously adjusted the sofa cushions, and the children anxiously looked out the window. When the doorbell finally rang, everyone stood still for a moment. John took a deep breath and opened the door. There stood David, thinner and with grayer hair, but with a look of nervousness and hope in his eyes that John had never seen before. "Hello," David said softly, his voice heavy with emotion. "Welcome," John replied, surprising himself by stepping forward and embracing his brother. The hug, although brief and somewhat awkward, marked the beginning of a new chapter in the life of the Miller family. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be moments of doubt and tension. But in that instant, everyone felt the possibility of a future in which love and forgiveness would triumph over resentment and pain. As the family gathered in the living room, sharing stories and beginning the long process of truly getting to know each other, John couldn't help but think about how far they had come. From a marriage on the brink of collapse and a family nearly destroyed by revenge, they were now on the path to a stronger, deeper bond than ever. Looking at Sarah, who was smiling as Matthew bombarded David with questions about his life, John felt a surge of gratitude and love. They had overcome the unthinkable and somehow had come out stronger on the other side. The future was still uncertain, and the path to complete reconciliation would be long and sometimes difficult. But John knew that as long as they stayed united and open to the transformative power of love and forgiveness, they could overcome any obstacle. The battle for love and fortune had ended, but the true victory was not in material goods or winning a legal fight. The true victory was in healed hearts, restored relationships, and a reunited family. The following months after David's release were a period of adjustment for everyone. The Miller family embarked on a complex emotional journey, full of ups and downs, as they tried to integrate David into their lives. John, determined to make up for the lost years, spent hours with David, sharing stories of his childhood and learning about his brother's life. They discovered, to their surprise, that they had a lot in common. From their love of chess to their passion for classical literature, Sarah, though initially cautious, began to see a different side of David one day. While watching him play with Matthew in the garden, teaching him how to throw a baseball, Sarah realized she was seeing the man David could have been if life had given him other opportunities. Sophie, for her part, found an unexpected confidant in her uncle David. With his unique perspective on mistakes and regret, became a mentor to the teenager, helping her navigate the complex high school years with a wisdom born from his own difficult experiences. However, not everything was rosy. There were days when old resentments surfaced, moments when distrust threatened to destroy the fragile balance they had achieved one night. During a family dinner, an argument about the past quickly escalated. "You'll never understand what it's like to grow up knowing your father rejected you," David shouted. Slamming his fist on the table, John, hurt and angry, responded, "And you'll never understand the pressure of living up to the expectations of a father who expected you to be perfect at everything." The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie and Matthew stared at their father and uncle with wide eyes, never having witnessed such an explosion of emotions between them. It was Sarah who finally broke the tension. "Enough," she said firmly. "You both suffered. You were both victims of the decisions of a man who is no longer here to answer for them. But you're here now, with the opportunity to be better than him, to be the brothers you always should have been." Her words acted like a balm, dispelling the anger and leaving in its place a shared understanding of the pain they had both experienced. That night marked a turning point. John and David, recognizing the need to address their issues in a healthier way, began attending therapy together. Slowly, they began to unearth and heal the wounds of the past, building a genuine fraternal relationship in the process. Meanwhile, the family dynamic continued to evolve. David, who had spent much of his life feeling like an outsider, began to find his place in the Miller family. He became the fun uncle who took Sophie and Matthew to amusement parks, the brother who supported John in his business ventures, and, surprisingly, a good friend to Sarah. One day, almost 2 years after the dramatic revelation in the warehouse, the family decided to take a trip to the beach. As John and David walked along the shore, talking and laughing like the brothers they always should have been, Sarah watched them from a distance, with Sophie and Matthew building sandcastles by her side. "Mom," Sophie said, looking at her father and uncle, "do you think things will always be this good now?" Sarah smiled, hugging her children. "Life is never perfect, honey. There will be difficult times, disagreements, and misunderstandings. But if there's love, forgiveness, and a willingness to work together, we can overcome anything." As the sun set on the horizon, bathing the scene in golden and pink hues, John and David returned to where the rest of the family was. They all sat together on the sand, sharing stories and laughter, united not just by blood, but by love and shared experiences. In that moment, John looked around and felt a deep sense of peace and gratitude. The battle for love and fortune had been long and painful, but the final prize was much more valuable than any material wealth. They had won a stronger, more united and more complete family than they had ever imagined. The path to healing and reconciliation had not been easy, and they knew there would still be challenges ahead. But as he watched his wife, his children, and his newly discovered brother, John, knew that together they could face anything life threw at them. The telenovela of their lives had had unexpected twists, moments of high drama and shocking revelations. But in the end, love, compassion, and forgiveness had triumphed over hatred and revenge. And so as the stars began to appear in the night sky, the Miller family prepared for the next chapter of their lives, one they would write together with all their imperfections and beauty. 5 years had passed since that dramatic day in the warehouse. The lives of the Miller family had changed in ways none of them could have imagined. John, inspired by his own experience of family reconciliation, had reoriented much of his business efforts towards philanthropic projects. He founded an organization dedicated to reuniting separated families and providing psychological support to those who had suffered family traumas. Sarah, for her part, had resumed her career as a psychologist, specializing in family therapy. Her own story of overcoming and forgiveness had become a source of inspiration for many of her patients. David, determined to make amends for his past mistakes, had become a passionate advocate for prison reform. Using his business skills for good, he had established a job reintegration program for ex-convicts, offering them a second chance at life. Sophie, now a young adult, was in her first year of college, studying law with the ambition to specialize in family rights. Her family's experience had motivated her to fight for justice and reconciliation in the legal system. Matthew, in his last year of high school, had become a talented musician, composing songs that often reflected the themes of forgiveness and redemption that had marked his childhood. It was John's 50th birthday, and the whole family had gathered to celebrate. The Miller house was filled with laughter, music, and the aroma of John's favorite paella that Sarah and David were preparing together in the kitchen. As John watched his family and friends gathered in the garden, he couldn't help but reflect on the incredible journey they had been on. He approached David, who was adjusting the grill for the barbecue. "Who would have thought we'd be here like this, after everything that happened?" John said, placing a hand on his brother's shoulder. David smiled, a smile that now reached his eyes, free from the resentment that had once consumed him. "Certainly not me," he replied, "but I'm grateful every day for this second chance." At that moment, Sophie approached them, holding an envelope in her hands. "Dad, Uncle David," she said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "There's something I want to share with you." She opened the envelope and pulled out a letter. "I've been accepted into an internship program at the International Court of Human Rights in The Hague," she announced, her eyes shining with excitement. John and David exchanged a look of pride and amazement. "Sophie, that's incredible," John said, hugging his daughter. "I couldn't have gotten here without you," Sophie said, looking at her father and uncle. "Your story, our family story, showed me the power of forgiveness and restorative justice. I want to take that message to the world." As the news spread through the party, with Sarah crying with joy and Matthew spontaneously composing a celebratory song, John found himself momentarily overwhelmed with emotion. He looked at his family. Sarah, the woman who had stood by his side through everything, stronger and more beautiful than ever. David, the brother who had gone from being his greatest enemy to one of his closest confidants. Sophie, the girl who had once been kidnapped and was now preparing to fight for justice on the international stage. And Matthew, whose music filled the air with notes of hope and love. At that moment, John realized that true wealth was not in his bank, accounts, or properties. It was here, in this garden, in the bonds that had been tested, broken, and rebuilt stronger than ever. The battle for love and fortune had ended long ago, but its fruits continued to ripen, sweeter with each passing year. What was once a story of betrayal and revenge had been transformed into a testament to the power of love, forgiveness, and redemption. As the sun began to set, bathing the scene in a warm, golden glow, John raised his glass. "To family," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "To the love that heals, the forgiveness that frees, and the hope that never dies." Everyone raised their glasses, united not just by blood, but by shared experiences, healed wounds, and the love that had triumphed over every obstacle. And so, as night fell gently over the Miller house filled with love and promises of a bright future, John knew that this was the true fortune he had fought for all his life, a fortune that no amount of money could buy and no adversity could destroy. 10 more years had passed since that memorable 50th birthday of John's the Miller family had expanded and evolved in ways none of them could have predicted. It was a sunny Sunday afternoon, and John and Sarah's house buzzed with activity. The garden, once a scene of confrontations and reconciliations, was now filled with children's laughter and lively conversations. John, with a few more grey hairs but the same bright eyes, played with his grandchildren on the lawn. Sarah, as elegant as ever, served lemonade to the guests, her radiant smile a testament to the peace she had found. David, who now ran the Social Reintegration Foundation founded by John, chatted animatedly with Sophie about her latest case at the International Court. Sophie, having become a respected human rights lawyer, had recently returned from a mission abroad. Matthew, accompanied by his pregnant wife, gently strummed the guitar, his melodies intertwining with the murmur of conversations and laughter. In the midst of the gathering, John called for everyone's attention with a glass. In his hand, he looked around at the faces of the people he loved most in the world. "Many years ago," he began, his voice charged with emotion, "we were in the midst of a battle I thought would destroy us, a battle for money, for pride, for revenge. But today, looking at all of you, I realized that battle led us exactly where we were meant to be." He paused, his eyes meeting Sarah's, then David's. "We learned that true wealth is not in bank, accounts, or properties. It's here, in the bonds we've forged, in the love we've cultivated, in the forgiveness we've granted and received." David nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Sarah squeezed John's hand, a silent confirmation of every word. "Sophie," John continued, looking at his daughter, "your fight for justice on the international stage fills me with a pride I can't express in words. Matthew, your music has healed hearts. Beyond our family and David," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "My brother, your transformation and dedication to helping others is a testament to the power of love and redemption." John raised his glass. "To our family, to the battles that have strengthened us, to the love that has healed us, and to the future we build together every day." Everyone raised their glasses, united in a moment of profound gratitude and love. As the sun began to set, bathing the scene in a warm, golden glow, John found himself reflecting on the incredible journey they had been on. From a marriage on the brink of collapse and a family nearly destroyed by revenge, they had emerged stronger, more united and more complete than they had ever imagined. The battle for love and fortune had ended long ago, but its fruits continued to ripen, sweeter with each passing year. What was once a story of betrayal and revenge had been transformed into a legacy of love, forgiveness, and hope. Looking around at the 3 generations of Millers gathered in harmony, John knew that this was the true, happy ending. It wasn't a perfect ending, because life never is. There would be more challenges, more tears, more moments of doubt, but there would also be more love, more laughter, more moments of pure joy. And as night fell softly over the Miller house, filled with love and promises of a bright future, John knew that this was the true fortune he had fought for all his life, a fortune that no amount of money could buy and no adversity could destroy. The music from Matthew rose softly into the night air, a melody that spoke of second chances and unconditional love. Sophie joined her brother, her voice blending harmoniously with the guitar, singing about the strength that comes from forgiveness. Sarah approached John, intertwining her fingers with his. "Who would have thought we'd end up like this?" she whispered, resting her head on her husband's shoulder. John smiled, gently kissing Sarah's forehead. "Life has a funny way of leading us exactly where we need to be," he replied. David approached the couple, his eyes shining with a mixture of gratitude and brotherly affection. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice heavy with emotion, "for not giving up on me, for giving me the family I always dreamed of having." John hugged his brother, tears streaming freely down his cheeks. "Thank you, David, for teaching us the true meaning of forgiveness and redemption." As the 3 of them embraced, Sophie and Matthew joined, the group hug, followed by the grandchildren and the rest of the extended family. It was a moment of pure connection, a living testament to the transformative power of love. As the night wore on, the party began to wind down. Guests slowly left, leaving behind echoes of laughter and promises of future gatherings. Finally, only the immediate family remained. John looked around at the faces of the people he loved most in the world: Sarah, his life partner, whose love had weathered the fiercest storms; David, the brother who had gone from being an enemy to a pillar of strength in his life; Sophie, the daughter whose compassion and sense of justice filled him with pride every day; Matthew, whose music had been a balm to their souls in the darkest moments. "You know," John said, his voice soft but filled with conviction, "our story could have been a tragedy. We could have been lost in resentment, revenge, and pain, but we chose a different path. We chose love, forgiveness, and hope." Sarah nodded, her eyes shining with tears of happiness. "And that choice has brought us here stronger and more united than ever." David raised his glass in a final toast. "To the Miller family," he said, his voice ringing with emotion. "To the love that heals, the forgiveness that frees, and the hope that never dies." "To the Miller family," they all repeated in unison, their glasses clinking in the starry night. As the moon rose in the sky, bathing the garden in its soft, silvery light, John felt a deep sense of peace and fulfillment. The battle for love and fortune had ended long ago, but its fruits continued to ripen, sweeter with each passing year. What was once a story of betrayal and revenge had been transformed into a legacy of love, forgiveness, and hope. A legacy that would continue to inspire future generations of the Miller family, reminding them that true treasure is not found in material wealth, but in the unbreakable bonds of family love. And so, as the stars shone in the night sky, the Miller family prepared for the next chapter of their lives. Chapter they would write together, with all their imperfections and beauty, always guided by the love they had fought so hard to preserve and nurture, because in the end, that was the true fortune they had fought for. A fortune that no amount of money could buy, and no adversity could destroy. The love of a family, united not just by blood, but by shared experiences healed wounds and granted forgiveness. And as John looked at his family one last time before entering the house, he knew he wouldn't change a thing about their journey. Every tear, every moment of doubt, every battle fought had been worth it, because it had brought him here, to this perfect moment of love and family unity. The battle for love and fortune had ended, and love had triumphed,